The Ghost Catcher, Part 2. In the tavern, people were merry. Skell the barman had seen his tavern in states of sadness and in joy, had watched people sit in quiet, peaceful reflection, and on the same day had helped carry men to their horses for their inability to make the walk by themselves. That eve was a good one so far, like they had had so many of. The summer was winding down to a close, and soon the men who worked the fields would be spending more time out on their boats, and people were celebrating a fruitful summer and toasting to a good winter. At the bar, Mac Bates, father of Timmy, a great big man with a beard to match, sat between several younger men, holding court and keeping the spirits high. Skell had known Mac for years, probably as far back as when they were boys who had played in the streets as well, and the barman always found a smile on his face when the old tailor settled in for the night. "And so the one man says to the chaplain," said Mac, "but that can't be my wife, she's far too pretty." To which the assembled audience roared with laughter, and a few of the field lads leaned forward to chink their tankards against his. Skell himself laughed as well and carried on pulling more ale from the pipes, when he abruptly stopped as Mac's son burst through the heavy wooden door like a very scruffy blur, followed less than a moment later by Jeff Cull, both of whom looked as though they had just run there from the other side of the land. Mac Bates stopped being amused as quickly as the two boys had arrived. "What in blazes are you doing here?" the big man demanded of his boy, turning his head as he did to include Jeff in the question as well. The two boys stood before Mac, trembling at the possibility of being subject to his anger. They knew very well that they were only allowed in the tavern on special occasions, and certainly only ever in the daytime. "The sun's long down and you aren't in bed, so what's the story then?" demanded Mac when they didn't answer his original question. The whole tavern had gone hushed and silent, and in that moment Timmy had never felt like such a small boy stood in the midst of so many glaring giants, all of whom looked down at him waiting to answer. The only problem he knew was that it was almost certain that no one was about to believe what was going to come out of his mouth. "Something got out," mumbled Timmy through trembling lips. "What's that?" snapped Mac, still bearing down over the boys. "Speak up!" "Something got out," Timmy repeated, much louder than he had meant to, so much so he surprised himself at the sound of his voice carrying around the tavern. "Got out of where? What are you talking about?" Mac was becoming impatient. He was a good man, Skell knew, and a good father, and everyone else knew it as well. But something about the way the little boy trembled didn't quite add up to the barman. Something about the way he stood said it wasn't his father that scared him. "Boys," said the barman, making a few people jump at the sudden interjection of a third party. "Answer. What got out of where?" Timmy gulped and looked at Jeff, who was still only staring wide-eyed and slack-jawed up at Mac. "Something dark," stammered Timmy. "Something got out of the dark." The temperature in the room dropped noticeably as the little boy's voice carried around the stone flagon walls, and at a few tables mutters and whispers picked up. Above his beard, Mac Bates' eyes narrowed, and a hand like a shovel blade formed into a fist with one large finger pointed down at his son. "Now you listen here, boy," he growled. "I don't mind if you've been out of bed. I don't mind all that much if you've been playing with Jeff here. But if you've come in here to scare everyone with some of this nonsense about the dark that isn't true, so help me all if I don't slap some sense—" It was at this moment, as Timmy was half planning how to justify and explain what they'd seen and half thinking what it would be like if his father actually killed him, when Henry James stumbled through the door, looking white as sea spray, making everyone look up in surprise. "Henry?" said Skell, half in greeting and half in query. "Shh," Henry began. "Shh." He tried again. Mac looked at the simpleton for a moment, and his brow furrowed in thought. As Henry tried again to articulate himself, Mac looked down at his son, who looked right back up and nodded furiously. "Shadow!" cried Henry finally. Mac looked back at Henry, and then out into the night behind him. "Skell!" snapped Mac sharply. "Give that lad a brandy and sit him down," he said, pointing at Henry. Mac stepped away from his high stool and in one deft movement picked Jeff up and sat him down in the chair. "You stay here and don't go anywhere. Your mother will have my guts for garters in the morning, but you're better safe here than trying to get you home now. The rest of you," he turned to the assembled men and few women around him, "go find the chalk and batten down the hatches. There was a flurry of activity as about half the people in the tavern ran for the door and out across the moonlit square towards their home. Henry sat shaking at the bar with his brandy in hand, while Skell picked Jeff out of the high chair and sat him down on the spirit shelf behind the bar, picking a piece of chalk from behind the bar out and handing it to Mac as he turned back. "You," said Mac as he looked down at his son, rubbing the chalk between his fingers. "Yes, sir," said Timmy. "Go fetch the ghost catcher," ordered Mac. And so it was that Timmy Bates found himself rushing back through the town, past the butcher's and the apothecary, past the ironmonger and the bazaar, up the steps next to the bakery, and along the gantry to Silas Finbar's door, only to find the weaver already waiting. "Mr. Finbar!" cried Timmy in surprise as he looked up into the kindly face. "Hello, Timmy," said Silas with a smile and a sigh. Mr. Finbar," repeated Timmy, like some broken gramophone recording. "There's something got out of the dark again, back down in the town. Something got out and scared poor Henry and me and Jeff too." Silas looked at the boy still with a knowing smile on his face before stepping out onto the gantry and locking the door behind him. "And your pa sent you to find me, did he?" asked Silas, almost conversationally as he stowed his large brass key in the top pocket of his shirt. Timmy nodded frantically as though there wasn't time to speak, which got a laugh out of Silas. "Well," said the ghost catcher, "I hope your pa's got everyone inside and got the chalk. Best you lead the way." Silas followed Timmy back down the stairs and out into the night. This time Timmy didn't run, perhaps because Silas gave no indication that they needed to, or maybe just because he felt so much less scared with the ghost catcher beside him. Back near the tavern, Mac stood in the cobbled town square illuminated by the moon. "It's full and ready to wane, Silas," said Mac by way of greeting. "Wouldn't have believed it even after the boys came in shaking at the knees, but it is the right time of year and the right stage." Both men stopped and looked up at the bright full moon far above that peeked out between the clouds. Timmy looked up as well, although he knew not what at. "It'll be tough," said Silas for the first time without a smile on his face since Timmy had seen him that night. "They'll be quick tonight." Silas looked down at Timmy, his face serious. "Where'd you see it, my boy?" he asked. Timmy looked at his pa for a moment as though worried that he might incriminate himself by speaking up. "Answer him, boy," sighed Mac. "We'll deal with that later." "By the tanners," said Timmy. "Out by the yard." "How many of them?" asked Silas. "Just a big un," replied Timmy. "How many of you?" "Just me and Jeff," Timmy told him. Silas looked up and around the square. No light shone from any house or room save the tavern, whose braziers still burnt outside. Every other window was shuttered and every door firmly closed. He looked back at the moon and then around at Mac again. "Henry?" he asked. "Saw maybe one or two," replied Mac, "down by the harbour wall near your place, just before they did." Silas nodded. "Best you stay here, Mac," said Silas. "I'll head over the harbour way and wait. They'll not try on someone your size." He looked down at Timmy for a moment and then beckoned the boy to follow as he walked off down towards the harbour again. "Hey!" called Mac as Timmy started to trot after the ghost catcher, who abruptly stopped and looked back at the shout. "I need him," said Silas, for the first time with what was almost a grim inflection to his tone. "What for, Silas?" called Mac. Silas smiled as he looked back down at the boy. "Company," he called back, as man and boy walked back off into the night, leaving Mac alone in the square. End of part 2.